The night watchman found Professor Mensah's office in chaos, papers scattered everywhere, furniture overturned, and strange markings carved into his wooden desk. But what made his blood run cold wasn't the mess. It was the professor himself, crouched in a corner, muttering the same words over and over. I can still hear them screaming. They won't stop screaming. Professor Daniel Mensah wasn't always a monster. 20 years ago, he had been a bright-eyed young lecturer with dreams of transforming Ghana's tech education. But power has a way of corrupting even the purest hearts, and at Kwame Nkrumah University in Accra, power came easily to those willing to abuse it. Now, at 52, he was known as the Merchant, a name whispered in dark corners of the campus, passed from senior students to freshers like a warning. As head of the computer science department, he had built an empire of fear. His system was simple but effective. Impossible assignments, surprise tests on untaught topics, and then the consultations. Success requires investment, he would say during lectures, tapping his gold ring against the desk. That ring was famous, a gift from his first victim 15 years ago, a desperate student who had offered it as payment. Mensah kept it as a trophy, a reminder of when he first tasted the sweetness of corruption. For Abina Nyarko, a final year student from Kumasi, Professor Mensah represented everything wrong with the system. Unlike most students who came from privileged backgrounds, Abina's path to university had been paved with sacrifice. Her grandmother, a cocoa farmer, had sold precious family land to fund her education. Every weekend, Abina worked at a cyber cafe in Adabraka, saving every cedi while maintaining top grades. But in Mensah's class, none of that mattered. 10,000 cedis, he told her during her consultation, not even looking up from his iPhone 14 Pro Max. The phone cost more than what most students' parents earned in 3 months. That's my final offer. Otherwise, he shrugged, letting the threat hang in the air. Sir, please, Abina began, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. I scored 95% in the mid-semester exam. My project was selected for the National Innovation Fair. I just need... Next student. Mensah barked, finally looking up. Their eyes met, and something in Abina's defiant gaze made him pause. Listen, girl, you're smart, I'll give you that. But intelligence without wisdom is useless in this world. Think carefully about your future. That evening, Abina sat in the campus garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. Her phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed her grandmother's number. Nana, she sobbed, I can't do it anymore. He's asking for 10,000 cedis. That's more than what we have left from the land sale. Her grandmother, Nana Ya, was silent for a moment. In that silence, Abina could hear the distant sound of cocoa pods being cracked open, the rhythm of her grandmother's life for the past 40 years. Abina, Nana Ya finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of ancient wisdom. There are forces in this world more powerful than corrupt men. Come home this weekend. It's time you learn about your great-grandmother's legacy. The journey to Kumasi that weekend felt different. As the VIP bus wound through the lush landscapes of the Ashanti region, Abina noticed things she'd never paid attention to before: the way old women at bus stops would nod knowingly at each other, the strange markings on certain trees, the sudden silence of birds near certain compounds. Her grandmother was waiting at the station, but they didn't go home. Instead, they took a taxi to the outskirts of town, to an area Abina had never visited. The compound they arrived at seemed to exist in a different time. Ancient trees formed a natural fence, their branches heavy with strange fruits and mysterious pouches. Nana Kusi, her grandmother, called out, "We've come." The old man who emerged from the compound wasn't what Abina expected. No dramatic robes, no beads, no stereotypical traditional healer outfit. Instead, he wore simple khaki trousers and a crisp white shirt. But his eyes held centuries. Ah, another victim of the merchant, he said, studying Abina's face. Your heart is heavy with anger, child, but also fear. Come inside. The interior of his house was a strange mix of old and new. Traditional herbs hung from the ceiling alongside modern solar-powered lamps. A laptop sat next to ancient wooden carvings. On the walls, academic certificates shared space with mysterious symbols. "You're surprised?" Nana Kussi smiled, noticing Abina's wandering eyes. "You thought all traditional healers live in the past? Knowledge is knowledge, child, whether it comes from books or bones." He reached for a small wooden box on a high shelf. The box itself was unremarkable, but the air around it seemed to shimmer. "Your professor," Nana Kussi said, "is not the first of his kind. Men who abuse power have existed since time began, but so have those who fight them." He opened the box and removed a small mirror wrapped in red cloth. "This is Ahwehwe Pa, the true mirror. It has brought down corrupt chiefs, exposed wicked priests, and humbled arrogant leaders." "How does it work?" Abina asked, drawn to the wrapped bundle despite her skepticism. "It shows people their true selves, not the lies they tell themselves, but the raw truth of their actions. For a good person, it brings clarity. For the wicked," his voice trailed off, "well, truth can be the cruelest punishment. But why me?" Abina asked, "Why not give it to someone else?" Nana Kussi exchanged a look with her grandmother. "Your great-grandmother was a powerful priestess. The mirror chooses its wielders, and it has chosen you. But remember, this is not about revenge. It's about justice. Are you prepared for that responsibility?" Abina thought about all the students whose dreams Mensah had crushed. About Kwame, who had attempted suicide after failing Mensah's course for the third time despite being a brilliant programmer. About Sarah, who had given in to Mensah's advances and hadn't been the same since. About her own grandmother, who had sacrificed everything for her education. "Yes," she said firmly, "I am ready." The ritual was specific. The mirror had to be placed in Mensah's office before sunrise on a Wednesday, the day sacred to Ogun, the Yoruba deity of justice. 7 names of his victims had to be spoken, and a drop of palm oil placed on each corner of the mirror. Getting into his office wasn't difficult. Abina had befriended Auntie Grace, the cleaning lady who worked the night shift. Like many staff members, Auntie Grace had her own reasons to hate Mensah. "That man," she spat, unlocking the office door, "he got my daughter pregnant 10 years ago, promised to take care of her and the baby. Now my grandson doesn't even know his father's name." The hard part was choosing just 7 names. Each name had to be spoken with purpose, with the full weight of their story behind it. Kwame Owusu, who tried to end his life. Sarah Addo, whose smile died. Michael Teta, who lost his scholarship. Grace Mensah, whose child grew up fatherless. David Ankara, who had to drop out. Mercy Kiofior, who lost her dignity. And myself, Abina Nyarko, in the name of all those who cannot speak. As she spoke the final name, the mirror seemed to pulse with a faint light. Or perhaps it was just her imagination, charged by the weight of the moment. The next morning, Professor Mensah arrived at his office earlier than usual. He had a meeting with a wealthy parent who wanted to discuss their child's grades, and such meetings always put him in a good mood. Money had a way of doing that. The mirror caught his eye immediately, such an odd thing, propped against his computer monitor, probably left by one of the cleaning staff. He reached to move it and froze. In the reflection, he saw not his face, but a grotesque creature bloated with greed, eyes sharp with cruelty, hands dripping with the tears of students. He blinked hard, but the image remained, becoming clearer with each passing second. And then the voices started. "Sir, please, my mother is sick. I promise I'll pay next week. No, please, I don't want to." Every plea, every sob, every desperate negotiation he'd heard over the years, they all came rushing back at once. He stumbled backward, knocking over his chair. "Security," he shouted, but when the guard came running, The mirror showed only his regular reflection. Throughout the day, things got worse. During lectures, he saw his students' faces transform into the faces of those he had wronged. The walls seemed to whisper accusations. His phone kept ringing with calls from unknown numbers. When he answered, he heard only crying. Even money brought no comfort now. Every bribe he accepted burned his fingers like hot coal. Food bought with corrupt money tasted like ash. His expensive car seemed to fill with sobbing every time he drove it. His colleagues noticed the change. The once intimidating professor now jumped at shadows, muttered to himself, and seemed to be losing weight rapidly. Daniel, Dr. Owusu, his oldest friend on staff, confronted him after a particularly erratic faculty meeting. "What's wrong with you? You look like you've seen a ghost." "Ghosts?" Mensah laughed hysterically. "If only it were just ghosts. They're all here, Benjamin. All of them. Watching. Always watching." But the mirror wasn't finished. Next came the dreams. Every night, he found himself in an endless classroom, surrounded by thousands of students. They all wore his gold ring, and they all spoke with his voice. Success requires investment. After 2 weeks, Professor Mensah stopped coming to campus. Students whispered about seeing him walking the streets of Accra late at night, talking to himself. Some said they heard him at the university gates at dawn, begging forgiveness from invisible accusers. The breaking point came during a surprise inspection by the National Accreditation Board. In the middle of their meeting, Mensah suddenly stood up and began confessing everything. The bribes, the extortion, the sexual harassment, 2 decades of corruption poured out in a torrent of guilt and fear. "The faces," he screamed, clawing at his own eyes. "They won't stop watching me. Make them stop watching me." But before the final scandal broke, something even more chilling occurred. 3 days after his breakdown at the university gates, Professor Mensah disappeared. The police found his Mercedes abandoned at Labadi Beach, his expensive shoes placed neatly beside it. A search was organized, but no trace of him was found. Then, exactly 7 days after his disappearance, every student he had ever failed or extorted received the same dream. In it, they saw Mensah standing in his office, but he wasn't alone. Behind him stood 7 tall figures in traditional royal Kent cloth, their faces hidden in shadow. As the students watched, unable to move or speak, the figures began to pass judgment. Daniel Mensah, the central figure, spoke in a voice that seemed to echo from centuries past. "You have been weighed on the scales of our ancestors." One by one, the figures recited his crimes. With each accusation, Mensah seemed to age years, decades, until he was nothing but a withered shell of a man. "Your punishment shall fit your crime," the figures declared in unison. "You who stole futures shall have no future. You who silenced voices shall have no voice. You who brought darkness to young lives shall live in darkness." The next morning, Mensah was found in his office alive, but changed. His hair had turned completely white. His eyes stared blankly ahead, seeing nothing. And no matter how many doctors examined him, none could explain why he could no longer speak. The scandal rocked the entire university system. Investigations revealed that Mensah wasn't an isolated case. He was part of a network of corrupt academics across multiple institutions. The story made national headlines: "University corruption ring exposed." "The merchant's empire falls." As the investigations continued, more victims came forward. The truth about Mensah's activities over the years painted a picture darker than anyone had imagined. His wealth, when investigated, told its own story: multiple houses, offshore accounts, investments built on the broken dreams of hundreds of students. But justice, once awakened, has a way of completing its mission. Other corrupt lecturers began experiencing strange phenomena. Some reported seeing accusatory faces in their mirrors. Others complained of mysterious voices. One by one, they confessed or resigned, unable to bear the weight of their guilt made manifest. The university system began to change, slowly but surely. New policies were implemented. Anonymous reporting systems were set up. The power structure that had protected corrupt officials for decades began to crumble. Ahwehwe graduated with first-class honors, her victory made sweeter by the knowledge that justice had been served. But sometimes late at night, she would remember Nana Kusi's words, "Justice has many faces." She wondered which face Professor Mensah saw in that mirror now, alone in his house with his guilt and the endless watching eyes. 10 years later, Ahwehwe sat in her own office at the university, now a respected lecturer known for her fairness and integrity. On her shelf sat a small wooden box containing a mirror wrapped in red cloth, not as a trophy, but as a reminder both of power's ability to corrupt and of justice's patient persistence. Students who visited her office often noticed a strange thing: their reflections in that mirror always seemed clearer, more true to themselves. They left her office feeling seen, understood, and most importantly, valued. Sometimes, when faced with difficult decisions, Ahwehwe would look at that wrapped bundle and remember Professor Mensah's fate. It helped her stay true to her principles, knowing that true power lay not in what you could take from others, but in what you could give back. And somewhere in Kumasi, in his compound where old wisdom meets new knowledge, Nana Kusi would smile whenever he heard news of another corrupt official brought down by mysterious circumstances. Justice, after all, has many faces, and some of them were masks of terror. As for Professor Mensah, some say he still wanders the streets of Accra, haunted by the faces in every reflection. Others claim he found peace after making amends with his victims. But one thing is certain: his story became a warning whispered in university halls across Ghana. Be careful what you see in the Ahwehwe Pa. The true mirror might show you more truth than you can bear.